So this is in fact the second time I'm recording this video because, and roll the clip, I recorded the entire first video, which is almost 20 minutes long, without audio. And so that was a lot of fun to figure out when I went to edit and upload this video a day or two ago. Ultimately, I got busy, and here we are the day before the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend begins, and we're making our predictions now because it's better now than never. Also, I can't afford to have my predictions be half-pointed so close to the end of the season because I'm fighting for a championship of my own, you know? But guys, what is going on? Welcome back once again. It is the 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix weekend, one of, if not the greatest weekends on the F1 calendar. Interlagos presents one of the most unique layouts in terms of F1, in my own opinion. As well as that, it is a sprint race weekend. Only two more remain on the calendar. And in my opinion, Interlagos is the only circuit that I think truly benefits from the sprint. I think Circuit of the Americas is starting to grow on me in there a little bit. I also could be biased because I get to go in person. But Interlagos always delivers interesting results. It is at the perfect point of a season to really shake up the championship or answer a lot of questions. It is going to be so much fun. I cannot wait for it to begin. Guys, we're going to make predictions in this one. We're going to be talking about our biggest positive surprise, our biggest disappointments, our qualifying top three that is going to be qualifying for the race on Sunday. So the session following the sprint. We'll be talking about our sprint winner, going back to the sprint. And then we'll round it out with our race podium, the Grand Prix podium, and then round it off, finish things off right with our one crazy prediction, as we always do. Without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and jump on into this predictions video for Brazil with our biggest positive surprise. Let's kick things off right with our biggest positive surprise. And this one, I'm going with a driver who has Brazil near and dear to his heart. I'm going with George Russell this weekend. Obviously, in 2022, his first season in the Mercedes, he gets his first win in Formula One in Brazil, where Mercedes came out and actually looked pretty dominant that year. I think George is due for a very solid result coming off of a Mexico City Grand Prix that I think left a little bit desired when it was all said and done. Now, Mercedes hasn't always done the best at Mexico, especially not in this era of regulations, but at the same time, I think there was a little bit more expectations on George than probably were ultimately, delivered. And so going back to Brazil, hopefully, returning to the location of your first win, vibes are up, vibes are good, and you're going to come in and put a solid result. I think this is going to be a weekend we see George back on the podium again for the first time in a while, and I think it's going to come at the perfect opportunity because this does feel like the type of weekend where, depending on the weather, obviously all of this is dependent on what the weather actually ends up being, but I think if the Mercedes can, if they can get the setup in a good enough window, this feels like one of those instances in which George will just kind of spawn at the end of the race in P3 or something and snag himself a podium. So I think it's his prime George Russell weekend. What do you think? Let me know down in the comment section below. But George Russell, congratulations. You're my pick for biggest positive surprise. All right, let's go ahead and move on ahead to our pick for biggest disappointment. And I am actually going against the grain with this one because it feels like the obvious pick. It feels like the pick that everyone is going to be going for. My pick for biggest disappointment this weekend is Lewis Hamilton. This is one that I think is definitely going against the grain, as I mentioned, because it is Brazil. It is Lewis, obviously a actual Brazilian citizen. They love Lewis there. He loves that country, and he always seems to save a little bit of magic for the circuit of Interlagos. That said, it feels like at this point in his season, in his first full season with Ferrari, it kind of feels like a lot of instances in which he was left wanting more than was delivered to him. Obviously, even last time out in Mexico City, it looked like we were finally on pace to see his first podium with Ferrari before ultimately getting himself a penalty and ultimately finishing pretty far down the order. So it just kind of feels like that trend might just continue. We've seen it multiple times this year. It feels primed for everyone wants to see Lewis do super well, and it just might not come to fruition. Add in the fact that he is replacing his race engineer, and so there's going to be that aspect as well. Obviously, they haven't necessarily gelled quite as much as you potentially would have wanted to. Partially, that might also explain the switch in general. But at the same time, this feels like a moment where everyone is going to want Lewis to, overperform, really nail it. In which, don't get me wrong, I do too. I would love nothing more for this to be wrong, to see Lewis finally get the result that I think he kind of deserves. He's had a couple of weekends this year where he's really looked very much on the pace, but just not necessarily had enough to finish in the top 3. This feels like it could be a spot for it, but at the same time, it also feels like it's going to go one of two ways. It's either going to go perfect and he gets himself a podium or more, or it's going to be absolutely the worst, potentially fighting towards the back end of the points. So time will tell which one we get, but unfortunately, Lewis, I'm sorry, you're my pick for biggest disappointment this weekend. Let's go ahead and jump and roll on through our predictions for qualifying. This is the Grand Prix qualifying taking place on Saturday in the second session. We'll begin in P3, and I'm actually going with a Ferrari, but it is Charles Leclerc's Ferrari. And I don't know if this really even needs a lot of explanation. They're going to be carrying a lot of momentum forward from qualifying and race performance in Mexico City. Now, obviously, Interlagos is much different than Mexico in a lot of ways, but Charles also does seem to have a bit of affinity for qualifying well in Brazil. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he finishes well, but I think at minimum, over a single lap, in the right conditions, he's shown in the past his ability to get the most out of a single lap, especially in that Ferrari. Now, while Ferrari are definitely, I think, good enough to challenge in the top 3, I don't know if it's going to be enough to challenge for a win, but at the same time, I think Charles and Ferrari will take a top 3 in qualifying, and honestly, so would I, because it really just kind of feels like they need to carry any kind of momentum. Obviously, with a new regs era coming next season, there's not a whole lot you can really carry over, but at the end of the day, in a season in which there really just has not been that much going on, I think they need a little bit of something, because boy, has it been one of those seasons. So Charles Leclerc starting things off on our qualifying predictions in P3. As we move on now to P2 in qualifying, I'm going with Max Verstappen. Obviously, Max, in a very similar vein to George and Lewis, in fact, has a certain affinity to the Interlagos circuit, to Brazil in this racetrack in these conditions. We've seen amazing drives from him, not even just last year, and what he was able to do in the torrential, horrific downpour that was that race weekend. And so we've seen in the past him do this. We've seen it many times before. Is the Red Bull good enough to challenge for pole? I think with his hands, I think it realistically is. Will it happen? My predictions is say no, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be all about getting in the right setup, getting out at the right lap at the right time, and who knows what will realistically happen. But if I average it all out, I think he would take a front row start, because all you need is an opportunity into turn 1, especially here in Brazil. And so I think at the end of the day, he'll take a front row. He'd obviously much rather have a pole, but a front row is certainly not too bad either. As we move on now to my pick for pole position for Brazil, I'm going with the McLaren of Lando Norris. We talk about carrying momentum forward from Mexico into Brazil, and I don't know if there's anyone carrying more momentum than Lando, who ended up winning the Mexico City Grand Prix last time out by a very large margin and really looks on the pace from the jump. I think this is a situation in which, especially given a practice session, a sprint qualifying, and a sprint race to get under his belt, an opportunity to really solidify and take hold of the championship as he's going to want to happen. Obviously left Mexico now leading the championship for the first time with 1 point after overtaking his teammate Oscar Piastri. And I think in qualifying, he definitely seems to be carrying a lot more confidence than Oscar, and a car underneath him will certainly be a big help on his way to a pole position. But I think he'll have what it takes, especially because a lot of what is going to happen in Brazil, especially if it's going to be inclement weather, is all about the mental and who has the confidence in the car at the time. So we'll see what happens. But Lando, congratulations, you are my pick for pole position. Following him along behind him is Max Verstappen in P2 and Charles Leclerc P3. All right, it is a sprint weekend, like I mentioned, and we're just going to roll through it right quickly because honestly, the sprint race kind of is what it is. While it will be exciting, I don't know really what you can predict because teams will have exactly 1 practice session, and it's all going to come down to who can deal with the conditions and put it on, the best foot forward in a special qualifying session at one of the best tracks in the world. We're going for sprint winner here in this one, and I'm going with Max Verstappen. Max is, I think, going to thrive in the ability to jump into one practice session immediately into a qualifying and then be able to convert that at one of his better circuits into a win. This feels like a prime position for Max to really, start and continue his challenge for a world championship. As long of a shot as that may be, he is definitely still in it, and I think it's going to start with a solid result in the sprint race, taking home the win. And while it might not be big points, it will be important to finish ahead of Lando as well as Oscar to continue to try and claw back any points that he can manage to pull back from the papaya claws of the team ahead of him. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure the sprint race will deliver a little bit of action, especially if we get a little bit of rain along the way. I would love to see it. But Max Verstappen, my pick for the winner of the sprint race this weekend in Brazil. All right, race podium on the way. Let's go ahead and get this party started with P3. I'm going with George Russell in this one. Should not be too much of a surprise. I sort of foreshadowed it a bit in biggest positive surprise. This has all the telltale signs of a Charles Leclerc Brazil unlucky streak continuing and George Russell inheriting a podium. I think it'll definitely take a lot of, a very solid race weekend to have that happen. I think he needs to put himself in position to take advantage of these incidents and, issues potentially, as well as potentially adjusting and reacting to weather along the way. But this is primed for a George Russell podium. I don't know anyone who would be surprised to see George finish in P3 on this one or more. Honestly, it seems like he'll do this every once in a while. It's been a minute since we've seen it. Mercedes has sort of settled back and taken a bit of a passenger seat to the title fight happening at the front with Max Verstappen and both McLarens. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do, especially considering how behind the pace they seemed like they were to Ferrari last time out. I believe Ferrari actually also re-overtook Mercedes for P2 in the constructors. So it's going to be an interesting title fight for P2. Rather, best of the rest in the constructors itself. So this is going to get interesting. But George Russell, my pick for P3, getting himself back on the podium at the location he got his first win. What more of a storybook, result could you have than that? As we move on now to P2, and I'm sticking with Max Verstappen P2. This is going to be an instance in which I think Max is going to do absolutely everything in his power to try and win the Brazilian Grand Prix. But I think unless the conditions warrant some absolute chaos, if this is a dry race, I think it's pretty cut and dry. I think the Red Bull is a good car in his hands, but I don't know if it's enough to truly challenge for race wins, especially with someone driving. Well, I guess we'll roll straight into my pick for the winner of the Brazilian Grand Prix, because I don't know if it's going to be much of a surprise. It is Lando Norris. So let's talk about this fight for the win here in Brazil. This is going to be a weekend where if Max is able to take advantage of inclement weather, changeable conditions, this, that, and the other, and Lando might struggle a little bit, especially, or even if he doesn't struggle, we've just seen the way that Max has been able to take advantage of these conditions and these types of conditions in Brazil. It bodes well for him. I think he'll need a little bit of that to truly challenge, because I do think that the McLaren is still that good, especially being driven with someone with as much confidence in the car as Lando is right now. It is going to take a lot for him to pull out the win. I think it could just be one of those instances of if Red Bull get the setup right, it might just translate. But we've also seen weekends where they get it wrong and he really struggles. I think we potentially could see a fun one here, but if we're averaging it out, it is hard for me not to pick Lando Norris to win the Brazilian Grand Prix and solidify his championship one step closer to the end of the season. I think if Lando is able to take advantage of the car underneath him, I think he should win this one pretty handily. Now that said, the McLaren isn't necessarily the best at those lower, the low medium speed corners, but at the end of the day, it is definitely still good enough to, walk this weekend. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm excited to see it. But there we have it, guys. My race podium: a Lando Norris win, Max Verstappen P2, and George Russell rounding us out in P3. And here we are, our final prediction of the weekend. It is our one crazy prediction, and this weekend we are actually going crazy this weekend. I feel like it's been too long since we've had a true, bona fide, absolute insanity prediction, because I feel like, if I'm being honest, looking back at some of the one crazy predictions that have come through over the last few weeks and the few rounds, I think they're getting a little soft, if I'm being honest. And on my own part included, I'll put my hand up. My hand is up here. Some of my predictions have been weak. Now, I've nailed some of them, but I think we're going absolutely way out of left field here, because my one crazy prediction: Alpine points. Alpine points. That's my prediction. Alpine, double podium here last year, thanks to some crazy weather. This year, threats of some potential crazy weather. It doesn't even need to be a podium. It could be 10th, no, 8th in the sprint. It could be 10th in the Grand Prix. Alpine points. If I wanted to get absolutely I would predict Colapinto, but honestly at this point, I think picking either driver to finish anywhere near the points, considering how bad they've looked the last couple of rounds, is insane in itself. I should really rename this prediction for this week One Insane Prediction. But alas, if it comes in, I'm gonna look like a god. Now when it doesn't come in, I'm gonna put my other hand up and go, yeah, I should have seen that one coming. But on the off chance, oh, the high that I'll be riding as we head towards Las Vegas is going to be immense, and it will be treasured always. But I don't know, feel free to tell me how crazy I am down in the comment section below. But guys, there we have it. For the second time, our predictions for the 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix. I hope you're just as excited for the weekend as I am. I do not believe it's potentially possible, but at the same time, this is one of the best weekends on the calendar. I look forward to it every single year. Interlagos is an incredible circuit, and even if these cars are too wide to really race it, I think it is the perfect track to test these drivers, and especially if you're throwing in some changeable conditions. It's going to be so much fun. The weekend begins at this point, only a mere few hours, a handful of hours away by the time this video probably gets up. So I hope you're ready for the weekend to get started. I know I am. Guys, if you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate it. Leave a thumbs up on the video. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, join our little community, subscribe down below. Guys, we'll be back when the weekend is all said and done to talk about what we saw happen, to see which questions get answered, see which questions are now on the list, but we'll be here to watch it all. Guys, I'll see you after the weekend is over, and I'll see you in the next one.